My name is Charles Epting, and you're listening to the Lost Labels podcast. Our guest today is one that's very special for me. Ivan Julian is best known as a guitar player for Richard Hell and the Voidoids, appearing on their first single on Orc Records, the Blank Generation LP on Sire, as well as their Kid with the Replaceable Head 7-inch on Radar Records. Richard Hell was originally a member of a band called the Neon Boys, which morphed into television. Richard Hell left television to join up with Johnny Thunders as he was putting together the Heartbreakers. He then left the Heartbreakers. He was sort of a punk in search of a band and decided to put his own band together, which turned into the Voidoids, who are now considered one of the most seminal New York punk rock bands of all time. Ivan Julian, for his part, was born in Washington, D.C. He sang in a Led Zeppelin cover group as a teenager, but got his first real taste of the professional music industry when he toured Europe with the Foundations at age 17. The Foundations being the British pop soul group best known for songs like Build Me Up Buttercup. Ivan returned to New York right around the time Richard Hell was putting together a band, and he became one of the 4 core members of the Voidoids, alongside, obviously, Richard Hell on bass and lead vocals, Robert Quine on guitar, and Mark Bell on drums, who would go on to become Marky Ramone just a couple of years later. The first Voidoids release was actually just credited to Richard Hell. It was released on Orc Records in 1976. It was a 3-song 7-inch. The A-side was Another World, the B-side, Blank Generation, and You Gotta Lose. Blank Generation would go on to become Hell's signature song and the title of his full-length album, released the following year on Sire Records. The Another World EP was picked up by Stiff Records, who released it later in 1976 as the 7th 7-inch in their discography. By 1977, more major labels were showing interest in punk rock, and Sire Records had already signed the Ramones. They signed Richard Hell and the Voidoids to release their first full-length, alongside bands like the Talking Heads, the Saints, and the Dead Boys, showing that there was more commercial interest in punk rock for the first time. September 1977 saw the release of Blank Generation, the Voidoids' first full-length album, widely regarded not just as a seminal punk album, but one of the most influential rock and roll albums of all time. But after that, the band decreased in productivity. If you read Richard Hell's book, it sounds like he got a bit burnt out on the music industry, and the Voidoids went silent for a bit. Their next release wouldn't come until 1979, when they released a one-off single in the UK on Radar Records, and by that point, the Voidoids lineup had already changed from the core 4 members. Mark Bell had already gone on to become Marky Ramone. Richard Hell was no longer playing bass, and the band had really changed by that point, and in its original incarnation did not last a whole lot longer. My guest today, Ivan Julian, was hugely influential in shaping the sound of those early Voidoids releases, and has gone on to both play on and produce and write many other fantastic pieces of music. So it's a real honor to have Ivan with me today. Ivan, to start things off, as a teenager, you played with the Foundations, best known for their hit Build Me Up Buttercup. How was it that you got to know Richard Hell? How did the two of you first become acquainted?
Well, I had just arrived in New York from Europe, and then it was in Europe where I played with the Foundations, okay? And I'd been there for, 7 months or something like that. I arrived in Europe with the purpose of finding and joining a band and continue touring and especially making records, because that's why, I left the Foundations, because, they'd already done records and they were just touring all the time and had no intention of recording anything new. And when I came here, I found out about a paper called Musicians Classified, which was basically, it's like a monthly music paper. Think of it something like the Village Voice, but only covering bands and things like that. Okay. And on the cover was Richard. And this isn't the story, right? Maybe, I'm not sure. On the cover was Richard, and that same issue, I had placed an ad that said, guitarists have gear, will travel. Just nothing, because I read all these wild ads back then, like, don't waste our time or we'll waste you. Anyway, but yeah. So I put the ad in, and it came out in the same issue. And so I'm reading I'm making sure my ad's okay, and then I'm reading this thing about Richard Hell. Now, on my way to England, I guess about almost 6-7 months before, I had stopped by CBGB's because a friend told me that, there's this band there of brothers called the Ramones, and they play there. So, I think it was like 4 in the afternoon, and I was so young I expected them to be playing all the time or something. But that I vaguely knew about CBGBs. I vaguely knew about it. So when I'm reading about Richard and like how he's this downtown poet, and he's got this band, he just left the Heartbreakers, and his whole history. That was all I really knew about it. And then Quine called me. And it was just happenstance, serendipitous, that Quine called me and said, "Oh, you want to come down to audition?" So then that's when I went to the audition. I mean, not really knowing what was going on, or that much about the scene, and in fact, I thought Quine was hell, because Quine was kind of running the audition.
When you mentioned Robert Quine, the Voidoids had a very unique sound with both of you guys on guitar. Was that at all influenced by television's twin guitar sound of Richard Lloyd and Tom Verlaine?
Absolutely not. We had no idea what they were doing. I had heard about Verlaine after I was in town a couple of months, and subsequently then Lloyd, and I actually went to see them, after I was already in the Voidoids. But no, what a lot of people don't understand is that scene at CBGB's wasn't necessarily a genre. There were so many different types of bands covering so many different things. Our idea for the guitar sound was the Yardbirds. That was our influence, and of course the Stones. Keith Richards is still one of my major idols, and how he works the guitar into a song, and how those two guitars play with and against each other. And the main, if I could say, chemical formula for that is that they're never playing the same thing at the same time. They're not just two guys, playing bar chords up and down the neck and playing the exact same chords. They're always complementing each other in some way. So that was the influence.
You mentioned the Yardbirds and the Stones specifically. It almost seems to me like you were the Keith Richards to Robert Quine's Mick Taylor. Although you did take, you get your fair share of solos, but it seems to me like you were more the rhythm section while Bob Quine was off doing his own flashy thing.
Yeah. Well, yes and no, because as you pointed out, I took a lot of the solos, but I don't know, maybe it was the age thing, but Quine got a lot of the credit for it. Quine is, don't take me wrong, get me wrong, is like amazing genius guitar player. But yeah, for the most part, I have to agree with you, because Quine hated playing rhythm, and even though like on Liars Beware, that's him playing the rhythm part and me doing all the other stuff. But whenever he played rhythm, I always loved it, because it was so kind of out there. But yeah, you could say that. You could say that. And I always jumped at the chance of playing chords in a song and driving it with the drums.
As much credit as Robert Quine maybe gets for the solos, he didn't receive any writing credit on the Blank Generation album, whereas you co-wrote 2 songs with Richard, Betrayal Takes Two and Liars Beware. What were the influences for those songs? Well,
Richard, announced that he needed songs, to finish out the album, because when I came in, they only had 3 songs. They had You Gotta Lose, Blank Generation, and Another World, which we kind of worked out in the studio. All of us should get credit for that. But but Betrayal Takes Two was definitely kind of my homage to the Foundations and their chord work and everything that they taught me, about like kind of just writing a song with a guitar, And then, Richard asked me, and he'd always ask me, well, what do you want this to be about? And I would give some vague, cryptic thing, I don't know, and then he would write lyrics to it. That was Betrayal Takes Two. Liars Beware was just, I don't know, it was just me reacting to being in New York, living in New York, not being, but living in New York for the first time. And I remember coming out of the subway at St. Mark's and, or I should say A Street and Broadway, and there were sirens, there were like, police sirens, fire engines, people going all over the place. It was hot. And that riff just kind of came into my head, it's like this. And, and once again, Richard asked me, what do you want to be about? What do you want this to be about? And I said, well, just fuck you, fuck this, fuck that, fuck it. and then he wrote Liars Beware. But yeah, because my influences are, vast. I started off as a classical bassoon player and sax player. So, I only switched to guitar because I couldn't relate to any of my friends as a teenager, playing that stuff, So, and I still listen to Chopin, or a lot of things today. If it's music, I like it. Hank Williams, George Jones. You could go on and on and on.
You talk about your varied influences. What were you and Richard listening to while making Blank Generation?
Well, I mean, Richard and I have to premise this with this. I mean, when I first moved here, I lived on West 83rd Street in Central Park West, and it became a hassle to get back and forth to the village. So Richard offered me to move into his apartment, to a spare room he had. So, I mean, every day when we woke up, we would listen to this James Brown album called Hell. And I don't know, I mean, if you've ever heard this album, it's got some amazing songs on it, but there's a gong hit in between each and every song. It's just typical James Brown, but also typically, brilliant James Brown. So I would say, that was a huge influence while we were making the record. It just was, because we were listening to it every day and just kind of the rhythms on it, stuff like that. Also kind of, mid-60s Stones. And that was on the jukebox at CB's too, like all these kind of outtakes to what you might think are outtakes, like, Who's Driving Your Plane, Flight 505, all these kind of things. I'm Free, all this stuff was on the jukebox. So that kind of like, opaque period of the Stones and James Brown, I would say, were the main things we were listening to.
Not long after you arrived in New York from England, the Voidoids somewhat infamously toured England with The Clash. What were your impressions of punk on both sides of the Atlantic? What was the difference between the New York scene and the British scene?
Well, you have to understand that I just lived there, like you said, about 7 months before or a year before, something like that. And I understood, kind of the cultural dynamic in England. And because, things were rough then. If you think about it, it was only 20 years after World War II, really. Maybe 25 or something like that. And, things were still bombed out, and everybody was on the dole. Everybody was on some kind of social assistance, and things were expensive, and it was just rough, So when I went over there, with, the Voidoids, I saw in America and New York, the music, or let's not call it the punk scene, was kind of a cultural scene. In England, it was political. It was much more serious. It was much more, kind of a social revolt, as it were, on a lot of levels. At one place, when we were playing with The Clash, we drive up to the venue. I think it was this theater, and it's surrounded by bobbies, surrounded by two deep of policemen, because they expected a riot, because they had the song White Riot, I Want a Riot. And of course the government reacted to it. They were banned from most hotels. Sometimes we stayed at better hotels than they did because they couldn't. The town had banned them. So it was much more political in England. From what I saw.
After Blank Generation came out on Sire Records, there was this gap where there was a lot of anticipation for a second Voidoids album, and you guys ended up releasing a single on Radar Records. There was talk about a full length for Radar Records. Can you talk about that period of the Voidoids' history?
Well, our honeymoon with Sire Records ended on the Clash tour, okay, before the record even came out, because we were promised the record would be out, in England the first or second day of the tour, which was still late. The record didn't come out in England until the very last day of the tour. So we thought, okay, well, it doesn't seem like we're getting much respect here. And things just kind of went downhill from there, as far as Sire went. And so then in terms of a second record, we weren't sure if we were going to make one or not with Sire. And I don't really know the story of whether Richard or them or both, and I would assume both, said, we don't want to do this. So then steps Jake. Okay, we meet Jake. And Richard had known Jake from before. And, Jake said, okay, well, let's do this. We'll put out a single, okay, and we'll make a single. When we made it downtown at the Green Street Studios. Then, you can come over and open for Elvis on his Armed Forces tour. So Jake was a breath of fresh air, because, Richard still touched him very much, but he was losing interest in the whole music business scene, and how much because it can, be a fairly horrid place. If you have any kind of, sensitivity. So he was losing, and he only wanted to play punk venues. Now the problem was that there were no punk venues. I mean, out in America, you know what I mean? It's like, there were 2 or 3 in the city that, but I mean, so we didn't play that much. So Jay kind of, interjected sort of a second wind into the band. Yeah. So I mean, that was good. During the same time, Richard still was not losing interest in, having a band and being in the music business. So, I mean, it turned out that even Jake just said, no, I don't want to do the second record, So that's what I remember about that.
At least from what I've been able to find, the Voidoids did not play all that much outside of New York City, with the exception of the Clash tour. Is that correct?
We did a Midwest tour. We tried to do an LA gig, which ended up with us taking the money and getting back on the plane. Because that's a whole other story, because they tried to kidnap me and lock me in a hotel room, because it was just wild. I mean, so anyway, yeah. So, but anyway, to answer your question, yes. East Coast, Northeast, maybe in Boston, maybe, and definitely the Midwest.
There came a time in the Voidoids where Mark Bell left the band to become Marky Ramone, and Richard stopped playing bass. What was that like for you as a member of the band?
To me, it was kind of over. We were just in flux after that musically, because what the Voidoids was the chemistry between the 4 of us. What attracted me to the band was Richard's bass lines on some things, because I'd never heard anything like that in my fucking life.
You mentioned Richard's bass playing, which was not classically inspired or maybe all that conventional, but certainly seems like it was an integral part of the band's sound.
Absolutely. It would have been, I don't know what it would have been. It would have been a Yardbirds cover band or something. I don't know. It would have been something entirely different. And every time Richard came up with a bass line, to me, one of the hardest things is to play bass and sing. I don't know how people do it. I have no idea. But I loved his bass lines. And also, Mark knew how to complement that. I think when Mark left, we auditioned 150 drummers. I meet people on the street today go, I auditioned for the Voidoids. I have no idea who they are. Because, Mark was part of that chemistry. So, I think it was a bad thing when he left. And from Richard's perspective, you probably know, he didn't, he felt that the bass, hunkered him down. And, it does. When you play a guitar bass and you want to perform and run around the stage, you can't really do it, but I just thought it was a bad move for myself,
Around the time the Voidoids were coming to a close, you were involved in a couple of other projects, one of which was a band called the Yankees, which I've been able to find out next to nothing about in my research, but the other much more well-known project was Sandinista by The Clash, which you appeared on. Can you talk a little bit about those gigs?
Well, but first of all, this happened after the Voidoids, when I was forming the Outsets, and that's when John Tiven, the writer, called me and goes, "Oh, I want you to play bass on my new record." And I thought, well, I don't really play bass. He goes, "Oh no, I want you to do it." So I drove up to Connecticut, or got a ride or something, and played on it. It was a session for me. I was amazed when it was presented as a band.
That's funny, because if I'm not mistaken, your picture's on the front cover of the album.
Yeah, I am. I was shocked at that too. I thought it would just be some credits in the back somewhere. I had no idea that he was going to turn it into a presentation, But yeah, that was the story with that. And that was, like I said, after I'd left the Voidoids, and then the Clash. They were in town. And they were at Electric Ladyland Studios, and they called me and said, "Come by and say hello, blah blah blah." So I went there with no intention of playing, just to say hello. And then they started jamming on some stuff, because a lot of that record is just jams, or just jams, I should say. And then they cut them up and turned them into songs. That was just once again serendipitous. And also, see, I knew Mick Jones and I were born pretty much the exact same minute. So him and I on the tour became friends. I met Topper Headon at a rehearsal studio when I was with the Foundations. Actually, when I joined the Foundations, long before this. Yeah, this is the weird, like I always say, it's a small world, so you have to behave. I was hanging at this rehearsal studio in London, waiting trying to find a band to join. And Topper was playing with Gary Moore a Canadian blues guitar player. So they were there rehearsing. So while they were doing that, I mean, he'd come out and we'd chat, and it's, applicable guy, and we kind of got to know each other and kind of like, oh, see you sometime or never. And then the next time I saw him was when I walked into some Rank. There's a chain of theaters in England called Rank. Some Rank theater when we were opening for them, waiting to do sound check, and I thought, I know that guy playing drums, and that was Topper. So I kind of had a relationship with them, before the Voidoids and during the Voidoids, and that's why they called me and said, come on down and hang out.
After the Voidoids, you formed a band called the Outsets. You released your first single, I'm Searching for You, backed with Fever on Contender Records in 1980. What was it like for you personally, transitioning from your role as a guitar player in the Voidoids to being a full-time frontman in the Outsets?
Well, I mean, I've always sang songs in bands. I mean, before the Voidoids and after. I mean, it was just a lot more responsibility and pain in the ass. It's because you're responsible for the band, and I also tried to run the Outsets as if it were a band, not me fronting the band, but it was I mean, my thing is always I play music, and if I could answer your question, I think the hardest part of the transition was actually finding my voice, to sing. So I was just relaxed, and it took me a long time to do that, I mean, but I've always written songs, so it wasn't that, it was just playing music. That's just the way. Even when I'm producing these days, what I'm doing is I'm playing music. I'm making music. So that, as long as I'm doing that, I'm happy.
I read online that there's a story behind that first Outset single. There was some issue with the way the credits were listed on the album.
No, there was that too, because the record company was out of Philly and they just printed all the wrong stuff. But they also printed the wrong mix on I'm Searching for You. So I don't know. It's just I saw Vinny D'Annunzio, the drummer, and I went around to all the record stores in Europe and got them back and spray painted Under Construction.
Have you ever come across one of those spray painted copies of the record?
No, I've heard people write about it and how pissed off they were at whoever did it because they put it. I mean, I thought if you saw this, you would never play it, But I mean, some people tried and they weren't happy.
After the Voidoids, when you're putting together the Outsets, and even further on in your career, how has the music changed from the days when you were playing fairly straightforward punk rock?
Well, I mean, in the latter part, the days of the Outsets, we were doing songs like Searching for You, and we were doing kind of what I considered rock and roll songs. And I realized that, and this was like at the beginning of the danceteria kind of, period, the period of discotheques, I should say. So they'd have a band on, and everybody would start dancing after we played. And then when we did, while we were playing, they just stood there. So I mean, I've always been kind of influenced by funk and stuff like that, especially Sly Stone and George Clinton, and so yeah, I mean, I just got more and more into dance music. So the Outsets ended when the bass player Danny Hirsch died. Okay. So I was kind of in flux and limbo once again for just not that long, like a couple months. And a band called Shriekback came to town. They're like this English band. They had like one guy from Dave Allen from the Gang of Four, and they had someone from Ecstasy, Barry Andrews, and they'd formed their own band. And it was a really great, wild, kind of hybrid of like funk and rock and roll music. It was great. So, so I did that. I mean, and did a tour for just about a year with them. I like it. It turns out that people I play with tend to tour a lot. I mean, and for a long time, So, so I mean, I did that, and then I came back and my wife at the time said, you're gone a lot. So then I got a call from Sandra Bernhard, the comedian. And she was doing a one-woman show called Without You, I'm Nothing at the Orpheum Theater on 2nd Avenue, where Shout is playing now, or Stomp is playing now, and which was a couple of blocks from my house. So, I talked with her, and basically the thing was she would tell some lines and jokes, and then she would break into songs. So I was in, that band doing that on stage with her. It was pretty wild. I love working with Sandra. I really did. It was like amazing. So that was cover songs. I mean, I think The Lion Sings Tonight or something. We did all kinds of stuff, and which is, I mean, once again, when someone says, can you do this? It's a challenge to me. I'm like, I don't know. Can I? Let me try. I mean, I played in an Irish band called the Rogues for, a bit anyway, around the New York City area, because, I mean, that was a challenge too, playing these traditional Irish songs. It was amazing, So there's that and there's that. Then, I formed another band called Mad Orphan, which was once again just kind of, rhythm-driven rock and roll. Yeah, I mean, I'm just always playing music. And then, then there was, Matthew Sweet as well for 6 years.
What was it like playing with Matthew Sweet? Because I think it's amazing that he also got Robert Quine to play with him and Richard Lloyd from television. He obviously really loved the scene that you were a part of in the 1970s.
Well, he knew a good thing when he saw it. I mean, all of us are, pretty capable guitar players in our own right, and I think Matthew was a fan of that period. And when he had his, when he was signed to a major label and, able to do so, he hired, who he could. Actually, I got the gig because I'd kind of heard about Matthew, and I just kind of thought I was a singer-songwriter. I didn't really pay much attention to him. And Quine played with him first, and then he wanted Quine to go on the road, and Quine goes, "I just don't do that," which he doesn't. I can attest to that. It was never pleasant being on the road with Bob. So that's when, Bob recommended me, and I came into the foil and all that.
Today, you're still very active as a producer. You have your own studio in Brooklyn. What goes into choosing the projects that you work on?
I only work with projects that are exciting and interesting, and I have some passion for. I'm not one of these producers or even engineers that can sit there and just listen to something that I don't find some kernel of satisfaction working with, or but from the foundations, from that time, all the time I was learning and watching, especially in the studio. And we're not really credited with it, but I think on one early printing of Blank Generation, it does say produced by Richard Goddard, Richard Hell, and the Voidoids. Because we all really produced that record. It's just because admittedly, Goddard didn't know what to do with us. He was from a different era, a different thing, and he just, when I think he got handed the project by Seymour Stein from Sire Records, and, he was used to working with girl bands and stuff. And he wrote My Boyfriend's Back. He was in the Strangeloves. There's an old song called In the Nighttime. And yeah, he was a drummer in that band. So anyway, but I've always been watching, and gradually I edged myself towards the board and starting having ideas and realizing what everything does and how to get a sound. And along with that came engineers telling me, you can't do that. And that's what really motivated me. I said, okay, someday I'm going to have, access to this and it will tell me I can't do that. And I carry it on as well, because if a band, or someone in the band wants to try something, let's go. Let's see if it works. I'm not going to immediately, kind of impose some limitations, mainly because I come to it as a musician.
That's right. You've got decades of having been on the road, having been in sessions with different bands, working with a lot of different people. That experience as a guitar player must really help you as a producer as well. You're not just coming at this as an outsider. Well,
that's why I like producers. I always seek out. To listen to producers that have done that. People like Nick Lowe. Nick Lowe, when we worked with him, brilliant. I don't know, did you listen to Kid with the Irreplaceable Head? I think you've heard it, right?
It's one of my favorite Voidoids songs, and Nick Lowe's production is just fantastic on it.
Yeah, I credit him with temporarily turning the Voidoids into a pop band. It's like, I thought anybody that can do that. And just working with him in the studio, the way he kind of, worked with people and got sounds, he's really amazing.
Ivan, thank you for taking the time to talk. It's a real honor and a real pleasure to speak to an original Voidoid, not to mention everything else on your resume. That does it for episode 4 of the Lost Labels podcast. As always, thank you to everyone for checking it out. I've got a couple of great interviews that I've conducted over the last week or two that I'm really excited to cut together and have online very shortly. So until next time, I'm Charles Epting. This is Lost Labels podcast.